Have you ever fought for something so important that you had to face your own fears and limits to achieve it? The metallic smell of blood hung in the air of the abandoned warehouse, mixing with the strong odor of sweat that permeated the room like a second skin. The graffiti walls, decorated with stories of rebellion and anonymity, reflected the dim, intermittent light of the yellowed lamps, creating a scene of tension and disorder. The air was thick, charged with adrenaline, and the crowd's screams formed a wild chorus, punctuated by hasty bets and chaotically shouted insults. In the center of that chaos, a makeshift wooden ring creaked under the fierce movements of two fighters. Mike Reynolds was there, standing out as an unstoppable force. At 35, his figure was a mix of strength and determination, his sculpted muscles gleaming under the oily sheen of accumulated sweat. His short, scruffy hair fell in clumps across his forehead as he moved around the ring, his face marked by a bleeding eyebrow. His eyes, however, remained sharp, fixed on his opponent like those of a predator calculating the final blow. On the other side, a burly man covered in tattoos advanced with heavy, desperate blows. But Mike was faster. His movements were precise, almost like a dance. The sound of his bare feet in the ring sounded like a rhythmic drum as he dodged and attacked with the same fluidity. When he finally found the perfect opening, his punch hit the opponent with enough force to knock him down, causing the sturdy body to fall to the ground with an impact that echoed through the space. The crowd erupted in deafening screams, a wave of voices that filled the stuffy air of the warehouse. But while everyone was celebrating, Mike's eyes said something else. There was no glory in his eyes. He raised his fists in a mechanical, emotionless gesture before letting out a heavy sigh and stepping down from the ring. The narrow hallway he walked down was almost claustrophobic, with concrete walls covered in dark stains and a musty smell that clung to his nostrils. Light flickered above him, casting shadows that danced like specters. As he wiped the blood off his face with a rough towel, he found Eric waiting for him, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Eric, a man in his early 30s with messy hair and ever-watchful eyes, wore a worried expression. The smell of cigarettes on his worn jacket blended into the environment, and his rigid stance reflected the tension he felt every time Mike got into a fight. "That was too close, Mike," he said, his voice firm but full of frustration. Mike continued wiping his face, never looking away from the wall in front of him. "I had everything under control." Eric let out a bitter laugh, crossing his arms tighter. "That's what you always say, but you know as well as I do that it's not true." Mike finally looked at him, his dark eyes reflecting a pain he didn't voice. There was something tired about his posture, as if he were carrying an invisible weight that threatened to crush him. "I don't do this for fun, Eric. You know that." The silence between the two was tense, broken only by the distant sound of the crowd dispersing in the warehouse. Eric stepped forward, placing a hand on Mike's shoulder. "I hope it's worth it, because it can destroy you." On the other side of the city, the contrast was stark. Reynolds Capital's headquarters was a temple of modernity, with glass walls that captured the city's glow and marble floors that reflected the light in an impeccable shine. The air had a fresh scent, mixed with the subtle scent of flowers arranged in carefully positioned vases. On the 28th floor, Megan Carter was immersed in her routine, but the sophistication of the environment around her mattered little to her. The room, large and well lit, exuded power and organization. But for Megan, it was the space where she faced a very different battle. Aged 30, she had brown hair that was pulled back into a practical bun, although a few unruly strands fell down to frame her face. His eyes, sharp and full of determination, focused on the pages of a report full of graphs and numbers that didn't make sense. Frustration was evident on her face, and she adjusted her glasses frequently, a habit she had when something wasn't fitting. Beside him, a steaming mug of coffee gave off a rich aroma that mingled with the subtle smell of freshly printed paper. But Megan didn't have time to enjoy the coffee. His mind was immersed in investigating suspicious transactions involving Reynolds Capital. When Tom Benson entered the room, she barely looked up. He was a middle-aged man with a robust presence and firm footsteps that echoed on the polished floor. His hands were full of papers, and his expression was as heavy as the responsibility they both shared. "Megan," "Any news?" he asked, handing her the papers. Megan sighed, placing her glasses on the table and massaging her temples. "Not exactly. These transactions, it's as if someone created a maze. Whoever did this knows how to cover their tracks." Tom watched her for a moment, a shadow of concern crossing his face. "Be careful. This company is untouchable in the eyes of the public. If we make a mistake, there will be no going back." Megan looked at him, her voice firm but full of emotion. "I won't stop until I find out the truth, Tom." As night fell over Manhattan, Megan continued to work in her small apartment, lit only by the glow of her laptop and a yellowish lamp that gave the space a cozy feel. The distant sound of sirens filled the silence as she reviewed the same documents for the third time. His determination was fueled by something bigger than work. It was a silent promise to herself, a desire for justice that connected her to a past she rarely mentioned. At the same time, in Mike's luxurious penthouse, he was reviewing financial reports with a lost gaze. The city glowed in the background, but the flashing lights seemed to mock him. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, and for a moment, he felt like a stranger in his own life. The sound of the phone brought him out of his thoughts, and Eric's voice on the other end brought him back to reality. "Mike, you have to be at the office first thing tomorrow. Don't forget." Mike hung up without answering, plopping down on the couch with a heavy sigh. Each day that passed seemed to push him deeper into a maze he didn't know how to get out of. As fate silently drew the threads that would bring Megan and Mike together, they both felt in different ways that something was about to change. Their lives were in opposite directions, but each step inevitably led them to the clash of worlds that would alter everything. Reynolds Capital's corporate event was a spectacle of luxury and ostentation, held in the ballroom of the renowned The Plaza Hotel. Every detail seemed to have been carefully planned to impress. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars on the ceiling, and tables covered in white linen tablecloths were adorned with elegant floral arrangements. The soft smell of roses and lily permeated the room, mixed with the delicate aroma of champagne being served in thin glasses by the waiters. Megan entered the room with firm steps, feeling the weight of the dozens of eyes that were turning to her. She looked flawless in a simple yet elegant black dress that highlighted her confident stance. As much as she was used to attending events like this due to her profession, her mind was far from admiring the luxurious environment. Each guest there was a piece of a puzzle that she needed to solve, and the host, Mike Reynolds, was the central figure in that puzzle. She didn't know exactly what she expected to find that night, but instinct told her that something important was going to happen. Her mission was clear: observe, listen, and if she was lucky, get a clue that would bring her closer to the truth. As he moved among the guests, the laughter and low-pitched conversations seemed like a distant murmur, unable to distract his sharp mind. Across the room, Mike was surrounded by executives, all laughing at something he had said. He wore a tailored navy blue suit that made him look like the embodiment of success. His smile was charming, but his eyes revealed the same restlessness he always carried. He hated these events, but knew they were necessary to keep up appearances. While greeting investors and answering superficial questions about the company, something caught his attention. A woman standing a few meters away with a serious and intense look. She didn't seem like she was there to have fun. Unlike the other guests, who seemed more interested in impressing each other, she analyzed everything around her as if she were putting together pieces of a puzzle. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Mike felt a chill run down his spine. Megan noticed the exchange of glances, but feigned disinterest and approached a nearby group so as not to arouse suspicion. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this man, who she identified as just another executive, might know more than he was letting on. The night wore on, and the speeches began. Executives took the stage to talk about Reynolds Capital's successes and its vision for the future. Megan was bored, but she remained attentive, watching every word and every reaction. It was then that Mike took the stage. The entire room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. He began speaking confidently, thanking investors and praising the company's team. His voice was deep and confident, and each sentence seemed calculated to win over the audience. But while the others seemed fascinated, Megan felt something different. It was as if that speech was a shield, a way to hide something. When Mike finished, he received a standing ovation. He got off the stage and began circulating among the guests again, while Megan discreetly followed him with her gaze. She decided it was time to act. He took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and approached him with the intention of asking questions. "Mr. Reynolds, isn't it?" she said, with a tone that was both courteous and provocative. Mike turned around, surprised for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. "Yes, it's me. And you are Megan Carter, financial researcher." She held out her hand, and Mike hesitated for a second before shaking it. The handshake was firm, but Megan noticed something. There were small scratches on his knuckles, which were slightly red, as if he had recently fought. She showed no surprise, but her mind began to work frantically. "Financial investigator?" Mike asked with a slight smile. "That sounds intimidating. Are you here for work or pleasure?" "Maybe both." Megan kept her gaze fixed on his without retreating. "Actually, I heard a lot of interesting things about Reynolds Capital. I thought it would be a good opportunity to learn more about the company." Mike realized this was no ordinary conversation. There was something about the way she looked at him, as if she was trying to see beyond what he showed. "Well, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. We are always open to transparency." "Transparency, of course." Megan gave a slight ironic smile. "That's exactly what I'm looking for." Before Mike could respond, an older man, visibly intoxicated, approached and interrupted the conversation. Mike took advantage of the distraction to walk away, but not before taking one last look at Megan. He knew that woman would be a problem. Megan watched as he walked away, feeling a mixture of frustration and curiosity. There was something about him that didn't fit. He looked too perfect, like he was playing a role. Later, while Mike was talking to another group, Megan approached again, this time without announcing her arrival. "You know, Mr. Reynolds, you have a knack for avoiding questions." He turned quickly, surprised to see her there again. "I wouldn't say that. I just don't like wasting time on formalities." "Excellent. So I'll get straight to the point." Megan crossed her arms. "What can you tell me about your company's recent financial movements?" Mike raised an eyebrow, remaining calm. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, but if you want to set up a formal meeting, I can put you in touch with the finance department." "Of course, because I'm sure the finance department has all the answers." The irony in Megan's tone was unmistakable. There was a moment of tense silence between the two. Despite being surrounded by people, Mike felt like he was in the ring again, facing a worthy opponent. Megan was incisive, and he knew it wouldn't be easy to push her away. "Look, Miss Carter, I appreciate your curiosity, but this is not the time or place to discuss business." "I agree, but it seems to me that you're the type to avoid certain discussions anywhere." Mike narrowed his eyes, and the smile disappeared from his face. He leaned in slightly, reducing the distance between the two. "You're very bold for someone who barely knows me." Megan maintained her posture without backing down. "And you are very mysterious for someone who claims to be so transparent." Before the conversation could escalate further, one of the executives called Mike, interrupting the moment. He took one last look at Megan before walking away. There was a mixture of irritation and admiration in his expression. She, on the other hand, felt like she was starting to find the gap she was looking for. Later, as Megan left the event, she looked back at the hotel lights. There was something about Mike Reynolds that intrigued her more than any other investigation she had ever worked on. She knew she was on the right path, but she also felt that she had entered into something much more complex than she imagined. Mike, in turn, watched the night from his penthouse, his face reflected in the window glass. He knew that woman wouldn't leave him alone anytime soon. The sun was shining brightly that morning, painting the Manhattan sky with shades of light blue and gold. However, the day promised to be anything but peaceful for Mike and Megan, each immersed in their own dilemmas. Mike was in the Reynolds Capital office, engaged in a meeting with his executive team. The room was a reflection of the company's reputation: modern, luxurious, and imposing, with glass walls that offered a spectacular view of Central Park. The air was cool, courtesy of the air conditioning, but tension hung in the room like an invisible shadow. "We need a solution to the audit problem before it becomes a bigger concern," said one of the executives, adjusting his glasses as he displayed graphs on the projector. Mike, sitting at the head of the table, listened silently. his face expressionless. Inside, however, he was conflicted. He knew the audit was just the tip of the iceberg. There was much more at stake, and part of it was his own decision to keep his other life a secret. "We will work with the compliance department and review the financial reports. I want this to be resolved in a week," he said, ending the discussion. His voice was firm, but his thoughts were far from there. Meanwhile, Megan was sitting in her office, going through documents she had recently obtained about Reynolds Capital. The familiar smell of paper and fresh coffee filled the room as she analyzed every detail with an intensity that made her heart race. Between the pages, he found something that caught his attention: a series of fund transfers to accounts linked to fictitious companies. At first, the amounts seemed small, but added up over the months, they formed a considerable amount. It was a clue, something concrete, but the connection was still missing. "Very clever, Reynolds," she muttered to herself, her lips curling into a satisfied smile, but not enough. The afternoon brought them both an unexpected surprise. Megan had decided to visit one of the fictitious companies mentioned in the documents, a shell located in an inconspicuous office building in Brooklyn. Upon arriving, he noticed that the place seemed empty, even abandoned, but the company's name was still on the entrance sign. He climbed the worn stairs to the second floor, where he found a door ajar. The musty smell was strong, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the silent hallway. As he pushed open the door, he saw a man hurriedly collecting papers. He turned at the sound, and for a moment, the two stared at each other. "Can I help you?" he asked, visibly suspicious. Megan wasn't intimidated. "Actually, yes. I'm investigating some financial transactions, and it appears this company is involved. Are you responsible here?" The man hesitated, but before he could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. Megan looked back, only to see Mike entering the room. He looked as surprised as she did. "Miss Carter?" he said, with an expression of disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "That's what I should ask, Mr. Reynolds." Her voice was sharp, and her look didn't hide her distrust. Mike stepped forward, assessing the situation. The man who was collecting the papers looked uncomfortable, avoiding their eyes. "This is one of our suppliers. I'm here to solve a logistical problem," Mike explained, with a controlled tone. Megan narrowed her eyes, not completely believing the explanation. "Supplier, huh? Curious that a CEO has to resolve something so trivial in person." Mike gave a faint smile, but there was a cold gleam in his eyes. "I like to be involved in all aspects of my business, Miss Carter. Maybe that's why he's so successful." The tension in the air was palpable, as if they were about to engage in a verbal duel. Megan knew she wouldn't be able to extract any more information at that point, so she decided to change her strategy. "Okay then, maybe I'll come back another time, when things are less busy." She turned on her heel and left, feeling Mike's gaze follow her every step. Outside, he took a deep breath, trying to process what had just happened. His presence there was no coincidence. He was hiding something, and now more than ever, she was determined to find out what it was. Back at Reynolds Capital, Mike entered his office and slammed the door shut, letting out a frustrated sigh. He picked up the phone and called Eric. "We have a problem. Megan Carter is getting too close. I warned you this would happen, Mike." "What does she know?" "I don't know yet, but she's smart, and she won't give up." Eric was silent for a few seconds before responding. "Maybe it's time for you to step away from all this." "I can't. Not now. I'm very close to getting what I need." Eric sighed on the other end of the line. "Just don't let it destroy you, Mike." Meanwhile, Megan returned to her apartment, where she spread the documents on the living room table. There was something she was missing, some detail that connected everything. She remembered every word of the conversation with Mike, every expression, every detail of the room where she had found him. The man who was collecting the papers seemed extremely nervous, as if he was hiding something important. She spent all night working, and as the sun began to rise, she found what appeared to be a crucial clue: a connection between the fictitious company and a series of financial transfers that led directly to an account associated with Reynolds Capital. "Bingo," she murmured with a satisfied smile. But behind the satisfaction, there was a growing concern. Megan knew she was entering dangerous territory, but she had no intention of backing down. The next day, she and Mike crossed paths again, this time at a cafe near the Reynolds Capital office. He was leaving with a cup of coffee in his hand when he saw her entering. For a moment, the two just looked at each other, and the air seemed to grow heavier. "Megan," he said, his tone almost casual. "Mike," she replied, maintaining the same tone, but with a hint of irony. He took a step toward her, lowering his voice. "If you're investigating my company, you might at least have the decency to be straight with me," and miss the chance to see their genuine reactions. "No, thank you." Mike let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You're playing with fire, Miss Carter." "Then I guess we're in the same ring, Mr. Reynolds." The two were silent for a moment, just staring at each other, as if each was trying to read the other. Finally, Mike walked away, but Megan knew it wouldn't be the last time they met. Back at the office, Megan continued connecting the pieces of the puzzle, while Mike, in his penthouse that night, stared at the horizon, trying to calculate his next steps. They were on a collision course, and they both knew the impact was inevitable. The rain fell thinly over Manhattan that night, creating a steady rhythm as it tapped on windows, building facades, and on the streets, reflecting the headlights of cars rushing by. The metallic smell of water mixed with asphalt filled the air, bringing with it a sense of melancholy that seemed to match Megan's mood. She pressed the collar of her coat against her neck, trying to protect herself from the freezing wind that passed through her in sharp gusts. The small umbrella she held trembled with each stronger gust, unable to protect her completely, while drops of water ran down the edges, wetting her boots. Megan walked quickly, but her footsteps echoed softly on the wet sidewalks. I had spent the last few hours in a corner coffee shop, a small refuge with the aroma of fresh coffee and old wooden furniture, which still seemed to exude stories from decades past. She had spent hours immersed in the files on Reynolds Capital, her gaze fixed on the numbers and transactions that seemed to form an indecipherable puzzle. The recent discovery of a fictitious company had aroused new suspicions, and Mike Reynolds' evasive behavior added another layer to the mystery. But that night, the tiredness was palpable. Her mind pulsed with questions that still had no answers, and she needed, at least for a moment, a break. Across town, in a neighborhood where the bright lights of Manhattan gave way to dense shadows and narrow alleys, Mike adjusted the bandages around his hands with precise, methodical movements. He was in a small, stuffy room at the back of an underground gym. The air inside was heavy, filled with the smell of sweat permeated from the old punching bags and the cracked leather of the equipment, mixed with the dust accumulated in the corners of the gray walls. Each breath felt thick, and the sound of his own pulse echoed in his ears. Mike was only wearing dark shorts and a tank top, which exposed his taut, well-defined muscles. Sweat was beginning to glisten on his skin, slowly dripping from his temple as he adjusted the last band in his hands. He looked at the cracked mirror on the wall, where his reflection gave back a tired but determined look. That night felt different. It wasn't just another fight. It was as if every punch he threw was an attempt to dissipate the pressure that was pressing inside him. Eric entered the room, leaning casually against the door, but his crossed arms and furrowed eyebrows betrayed concern. "Are you ready, Mike?" he asked, his voice full of seriousness. Mike finished adjusting the bandages and stood up, his movement fluid like that of a predator. Always, Eric watched him with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He knew Mike was talented and strong, but he also knew that no man, no matter how tough, could carry two worlds at once without falling apart. Meanwhile, Megan continued along less crowded streets, guided by information from an anonymous tip she had received that same afternoon. The address indicated a warehouse where, according to the source, clandestine fights took place. Although she knew it was risky and not part of her plans, the insatiable curiosity that defined her did not allow her to ignore the information. When he arrived at the address, he found an old, worn-out warehouse with windows covered in curtains of dust and rust. The sign on the facade was broken and illegible, and cars parked haphazardly around it indicated that there was movement inside. She paused for a moment, hesitating as the rain ran down her umbrella and dripped onto the ground. From inside, I could hear the muffled sound of music and voices booming as someone opened a door. With careful steps, Megan entered the place. The hot, charged air hit her immediately, almost like a shock. The smell of burning cigarettes, alcohol, and sweaty bodies filled the room, while the dim, yellow lights created shadows that gave the space an even more clandestine appearance. She lowered her umbrella and held it at her side, keeping her head down as she blended into the crowd. The mass of excited people surrounded the makeshift ring, a worn wooden stage that creaked under the weight of each step. In the center, Mike climbed into the ring, and his presence immediately dominated the environment. Megan stopped, still hidden among the crowd, and her eyes were drawn to him. Even though he was far away, something about the way he walked, the way his shoulders lifted with confidence, caught her attention. He exuded strength, but there was a shadow of vulnerability there, something she couldn't explain. The fight began with an explosion of energy. Mike and his opponent exchanged brutal blows, each impact echoing throughout the warehouse and eliciting screams from the audience. Megan felt the knot in her stomach tighten with each blow Mike received, although she didn't understand why it affected her so much. Her eyes couldn't look away from him. Every move was a perfect balance between strength and strategy, as if he was in perfect tune with the chaos around him. When a hard blow hit him in the face, causing him to flinch, Megan caught her breath. For a moment, she saw something in his expression, a mixture of pain and determination that made her feel something unexpected. It was almost as if she was sharing that moment with him, feeling each blow on her own skin. Mike's final blow was as accurate as it was devastating. His opponent fell to the ground, and the audience erupted in roars of approval. But while the others cheered, Mike only raised his fist briefly before leaving the ring. There was no celebration on his face, just a suppressed exhaustion that revealed the weight he carried. Megan barely had time to process how she felt before she decided to leave. But as she was heading to the exit, she was intercepted by two visibly intoxicated men. The strong smell of alcohol coming from them was almost suffocating, and the crooked smile of one of them made her freeze. "Hey, you're new here, aren't you?" said the man, leaning towards him. "I'm leaving. I don't want any confusion," Megan replied, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was racing. Before he could pass, one of the men grabbed his arm, and panic set in. "Let her go, now." Mike's deep, authoritative voice echoed through the hallway. When Megan looked to her side, she saw the fighter she had just beaten in the ring. He was shirtless, his chest still heaving and scarred from the fight, but his expression was cool and controlled. The intensity in his eyes made both men hesitate. "Who do you think you are, hero?" challenged one of them. But Mike took a step forward, and his presence was enough to make them both retreat. When the men walked away, Mike turned to Megan. "Everything is fine?" She nodded but was still visibly shaken. "Yes, thank you." As they walked together to the exit, Megan felt strangely safe next to him, as if this unknown man carried not just strength, but a complexity that intrigued her. Outside, the rain had eased, but the cold was still intense. "Thank you again. I didn't need to have done that," she said, looking at him. "Yes, I needed it," Mike replied with an intensity that made her heart race. Watching him disappear back into the warehouse, Megan knew it wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. Something about him pulled at her, like a mystery waiting to be solved. And at that moment, he felt that he was facing something much bigger than he imagined. The soft light of dawn filtered through the windows of Megan's apartment, bringing a feeling of renewal, but she was far from feeling rested. The night before had been a mix of tension and surprise. As he looked out the window at the busy streets of Manhattan, holding a mug of hot coffee, the memory of meeting the mysterious fighter came back to him. It wasn't just the way he had helped her that intrigued her, but something about his presence. He seemed out of place in that place, as if he was hiding something much bigger. Taking a deep breath, she pushed her thoughts aside and focused on the work in front of her. His desk was covered in documents, open folders, and scattered notes. The clues about Reynolds Capital continued to accumulate, but they were missing a central piece, something that would connect the suspicious transactions to a coherent explanation. As he rearranged the pages, he found a name that appeared repeatedly: Viridian Holdings. It was a shell company that, according to financial records, received large transfers from Reynolds Capital. At first it seemed legitimate, but a quick search revealed that it had no real activity. It was just an empty name used to move money. "I knew you were hiding something, Reynolds," she muttered to herself while her eyes analyzed the numbers with intensity. But there was something more. She crossed the data with information from other fictitious companies that she had already investigated and noticed a pattern. Each transaction followed a specific schedule, almost as if it was choreographed to avoid detection. He was brilliant, but also arrogant, and that gave him an idea. Determined to find more, Megan contacted a source at the Financial Crimes Bureau. The conversation was brief but productive. She gained access to a list of transactions frozen due to past investigations, and to her surprise, some of them had indirect connections to Reynolds Capital. The evidence was lining up, but definitive proof was still missing. While Megan delved deeper and deeper into irregularities, Mike was in his penthouse, in front of a laptop, reading and deleting emails with almost mechanical speed. That morning's meeting had been a disaster. An outside auditor had raised concerns about Reynolds Capital's operations, and he had spent hours trying to get around the problem without exposing too much. Eric was sitting on the couch, watching him. "How long do you think you can hold this?" Mike didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but his mind was far away. He finally closed the laptop and rubbed his temples. "I don't know, but I can't let this fall apart now." Eric snorted, shaking his head. "It's not just about what you're doing with the company, Mike. That girl, Megan, she's going to find out everything." Her name made Mike sit up straight. He had tried not to think about her too much since their encounter in the ring, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling she had left behind. Something about her posture, her determination, reminded him of himself. "I know she's getting close," he replied, his voice lower, "but I also need her not to give up." Eric raised an eyebrow, confused. "What are you talking about?" Mike got up and went to the window, looking at the city outside. "If she finds out the truth, maybe this will end before anyone really gets hurt." Eric was silent, trying to process what his friend was saying. But before he could respond, Mike's phone rang. He answered, and the expression on his face hardened. It was a call from one of Reynolds Capital's oldest investors, demanding explanations about the rumors that were beginning to circulate. "Yes, I understand. We are taking care of it. You have nothing to worry about," Mike said, firmly ending the call before slamming the phone onto the table. Meanwhile, Megan had decided to take a bolder step. Based on the information he had gathered, he was able to schedule a visit to Reynolds Capital under the guise of checking tax documents for a routine investigation. When she arrived at the building, she was greeted by a friendly receptionist who led her to the floor where the financial department was located. The air in the office was thick with the smell of fresh coffee and new paper. The employees worked in silence, but Megan noticed some nervous looks turning to her. It was as if they knew that their presence there was not just a formality. As he reviewed the documents presented, something caught his eye. An expense report that looked too clean, almost as if it had been fabricated. She pressed the employee in charge, a young and nervous-looking man, and his evasive answers only confirmed her suspicions. "I need complete copies of these reports, including international transactions for the last 6 months," she said, with a firm tone that did not allow for arguments. The employee hesitated, but eventually agreed. When he left to get the documents, Megan took the opportunity to observe the environment. His attention was caught by an office in the corner, with glass doors that offered a clear view of Mike, who was on a call. Even from a distance, she could see his tense body language. He gestured with one hand while holding the phone with the other. He seemed to be dealing with something important. But what intrigued her most was the fact that he looked familiar. That posture, that determined look, awakened a memory in his mind. "It can't be," he murmured, shaking his head. But the idea that the fighter in the ring could be the same Mike Reynolds began to take shape in his mind. It was unlikely, but it made sense in a disturbing way. When Mike finally ended the call, he looked directly at Megan, as if he had sensed her presence. Their eyes met for a moment, and Megan felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his eyes, a mix of alertness and vulnerability, that made her feel like she was getting close to something important. Later, back at her apartment, Megan reviewed the copies she had obtained. Among the documents, he found a recent transaction connecting Reynolds Capital and Viridian Holdings. It was direct proof that the company was involved in dubious financial transactions. "This is going to explode," she said to herself, feeling a mixture of triumph and apprehension. As he looked at the papers, the image of Mike came back to him. Something about him bothered her, but at the same time fascinated her. He was clearly more than he let on, and Megan knew she was about to uncover secrets that could change everything. In his penthouse, Mike was alone, sitting in the dark. A glass of whiskey rested beside him as he looked at a pair of boxing gloves on the table. He knew time was running out, and that Megan would stop at nothing to find out the truth. The silence in Mike's penthouse was broken only by the soft sound of rain tapping against the windows. He was sitting on the couch, looking at his laptop screen. The city lights flickered in the background, but his attention was focused on what he had just discovered. Megan Carter, the woman who crossed his path with disturbing frequency, was a financial investigator assigned to monitor the activities of Reynolds Capital. He closed the laptop tightly, running his hands over his face. Everything made sense now. The way she appeared at the corporate event, her incisive questions, and, most recently, her appearance at the warehouse where the underground fights were taking place. It was obvious that she was trying to figure something out, but what bothered him was the fact that she was getting closer and closer to the truth. Eric appeared at the kitchen door with a cup of coffee. The strong, bitter smell filled the room. "Did you finally find out who she is?" he asked, observing Mike's closed expression. Mike nodded, picking up the glass of whiskey that sat next to him and swirling the amber liquid inside the glass before answering. "Financial researcher. It's tracking our movements." "And what's the plan?" Eric approached, leaving the cup on the table. Mike was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew the most logical course would be to keep her away, to make sure she didn't have access to any more information. But there was something about Megan that made him hesitate. She was not just competent. There was a determination in her eyes that he recognized, something that made him want to understand what moved her. "I'll watch, see how far she can get," he said finally. Eric raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Observe? You're kidding, right? If she finds out what's really going on, her whole plan will go down the drain." Mike gave a small smile, but there was no humor in it. "I know, but I can't push her away. Not yet." Eric watched him for a moment before shaking his head. "I just hope you know what you're doing." The next morning, Megan was in her small office, surrounded by papers and notes. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating her face as she examined the new documents she had obtained. The connection between Reynolds Capital and the shell companies was clear, but what intrigued her most was how everything seemed meticulously planned to avoid suspicion. It was as if someone was playing financial chess, always one step ahead. Her phone vibrated, breaking her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Tom Benson, his boss. He wanted an update on the case and asked her to come to the office later. Megan sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he had no intention of backing down. As he prepared to leave, he remembered the night at the warehouse. The fighter who had helped her still occupied her thoughts. Something about him was familiar, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Later that day, Megan decided to stop at a cafe before heading to her date with Tom. It was a small, cozy place with worn wooden tables and the sweet smell of freshly baked bread. As she waited in line, she felt a presence behind her. He turned around and, to his surprise, found Mike. He was dressed casually in a gray coat and dark scarf. His eyes recognized her immediately, but he showed no surprise. "Megan," he said, with a small smile. "Mike," she replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Coincidence to find you here." He seemed genuinely interested, which left her disconcerted. "Manhattan isn't that big," she said, not knowing exactly why she felt nervous. Mike placed the order and, to Megan's surprise, pulled up a chair at the table where she was sitting. She raised an eyebrow, but he just smiled. "Don't worry, I won't steal too much of your time." She crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "And what exactly do you want?" "Maybe just a conversation," he replied with a casual tone, but there was something more in his expression. Megan didn't know if he was trying to distract her or if there was something sincere in his approach, but she decided to play along. Right, what do you want to talk about? Mike watched her for a moment before responding. About what makes you so determined. She frowned, not understanding what he was getting at. Determined? I don't know what you're talking about. You have a way of looking at things, as if you are always looking for answers. It's fascinating. Megan felt her face heat up slightly, but she maintained her posture. Maybe because I like finding answers. Mike smiled, but his eyes seemed to analyze her every reaction. And did you find what you were looking for? She hesitated for a second, debating whether she should reveal something. Not yet, but I'm getting close. There was a moment of silence between the two, broken only by the sound of cups being placed on the surrounding tables. Mike looked away, as if considering something. You're good at what you do, Megan. This is obvious, but just be careful. Sometimes looking for answers can lead to places we don't want to go. She narrowed her eyes, intrigued by the change in his tone. That sounds like a warning. Maybe it is, he said, before finishing his coffee and getting up. Before leaving, he looked at her once more. It was good to see you. Megan watched as he walked away, feeling disconcerted. Why was he being kind? And why did he seem genuinely interested in her? Something didn't make sense. Later, as he walked to meet Tom, Mike's words echoed in his mind. He was as enigmatic as he looked, but there was something about him, a humanity that she hadn't expected, and it made her uneasy. Tom was waiting for her in her office, reviewing some papers. When she entered, he looked up and smiled. Megan, finally. So what do we have? She handed over the reports she had prepared, explaining the connections she had found. Tom listened intently, but there was something in his expression that made her hesitate. That's big, Tom. If we keep pulling this line, we can expose something much bigger. He nodded but seemed distracted. I agree, but we need to be cautious. Reynolds Capital is not just any company. They have resources. Megan frowned. Do you think I should back down? No. I just want you to be careful. Tom's words sounded eerily similar to Mike's, which only increased his uneasiness. Back at her apartment, Megan organized her notes, trying to clear her thoughts. But as he reread the documents, Mike's image kept coming back to him. He was a puzzle, as was the investigation, and somehow she felt like they were connected in a way she didn't yet understand. Mike, meanwhile, was in his penthouse thinking about Megan. She was more than just a threat to their secrets. It was someone who, in some way, made him want to be better. It scared him, but it also fascinated him. The night was cold, with the wind whistling through the narrow streets of Manhattan, bringing with it an unsettling silence that seemed to envelop the city. Megan was on the terrace of her apartment, wrapped in a thick blanket, holding a cup of tea in her hands. The hot steam rose slowly, but it failed to warm the confusion that dominated his mind. The last few days had been intense. The clues he had gathered about Reynolds Capital were becoming clearer, but at the same time, something about Mike didn't make sense. He seemed like the kind of man who controlled every aspect of her life perfectly, but there were cracks in his facade that she couldn't ignore. Her mind went back to the moment in the cafe, when he had looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. It was as if he knew she was getting close to something dangerous, and at the same time, didn't want to see her hurt. But why? Megan hated to admit it, but there was something about him that attracted her. A vulnerability hidden beneath that layer of unwavering confidence. Across town, Mike was in his penthouse, sitting in a chair by the window, a bottle of whiskey within arm's reach. He looked at the reflection of the city lights in the glass, but his mind was far from there. From the moment he discovered that Megan was investigating his company, an internal conflict had set in within him. Mike knew he should keep his distance. She was a threat, a woman too intelligent for her own good. But at the same time, he couldn't get her out of his thoughts. There was something about her determination, her courage to face him without fear, that made him feel things he didn't want to admit. Eric, as always, was nearby, but this time he was silent, just watching as Mike fell into his thoughts. He knew his friend was dealing with more than just the weight of his double life, but also a feeling that wasn't part of the plan. Later that night, Megan received an unexpected text from Mike. It was direct, almost cold, but enough to wake her from her reverie. We need to talk. Meet me at Madison Square Park in an hour. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity and the need to confront him got the better of her. He put on a thick coat and went down the stairs of the building, feeling the cold of the night cutting into his skin as he walked to the park. Mike was already there when she arrived, leaning against a streetlight that partially illuminated his face. He seemed calm, but his eyes betrayed a storm of thoughts. "This is strange, even for you," Megan said, stopping a few steps away from him. He looked up, giving a small, humorless smile. "Maybe it is, but I didn't think you would accept a more formal invitation." She crossed her arms, trying to ignore the cold and tension in the air. "So, what do you want to talk about?" For a moment, Mike seemed to hesitate, as if he were choosing his words carefully. But then, he took a step towards her, closing the distance between them. "I just wanted to warn you to be careful. You are dealing with things that may be bigger than you imagine." Megan frowned, trying to understand what he was getting at. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" He looked away for a moment, before looking at her again. "I mean, maybe you'd better stop while you still can." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "That sounds more like a threat than advice." Mike took another step, now close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, even with the cold around her. "I'm not threatening you, Megan. I'm trying to protect her." She looked at him, trying to decipher what was behind that concern. There was sincerity in his voice, but also something he wasn't saying. "Protect from what? From you?" she asked, defiantly. There was a moment of silence when their eyes met and they locked on each other. Mike felt his heart speed up, but he didn't look away. He was so used to controlling everything in his life, but in that moment, he felt vulnerable. "Perhaps," he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. Megan felt something shift in the air. The cold seemed to disappear, replaced by an almost palpable tension between them. She should have been angry. She should have turned her back and walked away, but she couldn't. There was something about this man that pulled her closer, as if she wanted to understand what was hidden behind his dark eyes. Before he could think, he took another step, and suddenly, their faces were mere inches apart. She didn't move away, and he took that as a sign. Slowly, he leaned in, and their lips met in an unexpected and intense kiss. It was as if the world around him had stopped. For a moment, Megan forgot who he was, forgot the secrets he was trying to uncover, forgot everything. The kiss was full of repressed tension and desire, but there was also a softness that surprised her. When they finally pulled away, they were both panting. Mike looked at her, his expression mixing regret and something deeper. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, taking a step back. Megan was silent, trying to process what had just happened. She should have been angry, but to her surprise, she wasn't. She felt confused, but also drawn to something she couldn't explain. "Maybe not," she finally replied. "But you did." Mike ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated with himself. "This only complicates things. Things were already complicated," Megan said, crossing her arms. He laughed softly, but there was a sadness in his smile. "You have no idea how much." Before she could ask what he meant, Mike took another step back, as if forcing himself away. "Megan, just be careful, okay?" She watched him as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the park. She stood there for a few minutes, feeling the cold wind again. But this time it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. When he finally returned home, his mind was a mess. The kiss wasn't just an impulsive moment. It was as if he had opened a door to something she wasn't ready to face. But at the same time, I felt like there was something much bigger behind Mike's words and actions, something he was desperate to protect. Mike, back in his penthouse, sat in the darkness, tasting her still on his lips. He knew he had crossed a line he couldn't undo, but as much as he wanted to regret it, he couldn't. The days following the kiss were intense for Megan, as if something in her meticulously organized routine had been irreversibly shaken. The sky seemed grayer than usual, the air heavier, and even the familiar aroma of coffee in her kitchen in the morning couldn't dispel the whirlwind of emotions taking over her. Every time he closed his eyes, the touch of Mike's lips on his would reappear with an almost cruel clarity. The warmth of his hand on her waist, the shiver that ran up her spine when he pulled her closer. They were sensations that she tried to suppress, but that haunted her like a ghost. His work, normally a refuge, now seemed shrouded in a fog of conflicting thoughts. Megan was known for her ability to stay focused, but every report she read seemed to come up with memories of that night in the park. She shook her head, trying to clear the distraction, and delved even deeper into the investigation into Reynolds Capital. The connections between the company and shell companies were increasingly clear, but there was still a key piece missing to complete the puzzle. On Tuesday morning, while reviewing a file that was already worn out from being analyzed for the third time, something caught his attention. A recurring payment, disguised as consultancy, appeared linked to an account in the name of Michael R. It was a detail that, in another context, might seem insignificant, but Megan felt a shiver when she noticed the coincidence. The name was generic, but considering her recent suspicions, the connection to Mike was impossible to ignore. She adjusted her glasses, feeling her heart speed up as she crossed the data. The soft sound of keyboard keys filled the tense silence of his office. Using confidential databases that only her determination and some creativity could access, Megan tracked down the account and discovered the truth that stunned her. Michael R. It was Michael Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Capital. For a moment, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen with an expression of disbelief. The man who seemed so enigmatic and, in some ways, vulnerable, was in fact the epicenter of everything she investigated. Every intense look, every subtle smile, now seemed coated with a layer of manipulation. Megan clenched her hands into fists, feeling the betrayal spread through her chest like physical pain. But the revelation didn't stop there. As she continued to cross-reference the data, Megan realized something even more disturbing. The same payments that linked Mike to the account were also connected to clandestine locations, including the warehouse she had visited. A shiver ran up his spine as everything started to make sense. Mike wasn't just the CEO of a company under suspicion. He was directly involved with the underground rings. The smell of forgotten coffee on the table invaded her nostrils, bringing her back to reality. Megan felt her eyes burn, but she blinked quickly, refusing to give in to the tears. It wasn't just anger. It was a mixture of frustration and hurt. He had lied to her, hidden such a fundamental part of his life while distracting her with cryptic words, and that kiss that now seemed like nothing more than a planned distraction. That same night, in the Reynolds Capital office, Mike was deep in his own thoughts. The yellow light from a lamp illuminated the papers spread out on his desk, while he absently fiddled with his pen, lost in an internal battle. He knew that approaching Megan was a mistake. Every time he thought about her, he felt a mixture of guilt and something else, something he couldn't name. Eric entered the room with firm steps, carrying an envelope and an expression that Mike recognized as worrying. "We need to talk," said Eric, throwing the envelope on the table. Mike closed his laptop and looked at it with obvious tiredness in his eyes. "About Megan Carter," Eric replied directly. Mike felt a tightness in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral as he opened the envelope. Inside were photos of Megan entering the Reynolds Capital building, talking to employees, and most recently, outside the warehouse where he wrestled. He looked at the images with his heart racing, each beat heavier than the last. Who took these photos? It doesn't matter. What matters is that she's getting too close, said Eric, crossing his arms. You said you were going to watch her, but it looks like she's the one watching you. Mike was silent, his eyes fixed on the photos. He knew Megan was smart, but he didn't imagine she was so close to the truth. She's not the problem, he said finally. Eric laughed in disbelief. No, she is exactly the problem. You're letting her get too close, and it will destroy you. I won't hurt her, Mike said firmly, getting up from the chair. Eric shook his head, letting out a frustrated sigh. Be careful, Mike. By the time she finds out who you really are, it may be too late to make things right. The next day, Megan decided to confront him. She had arranged to meet at a discreet cafe in the West Village, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the woodsy scent of antique furniture. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting at a table in the back, his face partially illuminated by the soft light coming from a pendant lamp. Mike watched her approach, his eyes trying to decipher what she was thinking. When she sat down, the air around them seemed to vibrate with tension. I'm glad you came, he said, his voice calm but tense. I needed it, Megan replied, her tone carrying something that let him know she had discovered something. The confrontation was direct, her every word cutting like a knife. She accused him, challenging him to explain why the CEO of Reynolds Capital was involved in clandestine struggles. Mike tried to defend himself, saying things weren't that simple, but his evasive answers only frustrated her more. As she stood up, ready to leave, Mike felt something break inside him. He wanted to tell the truth, wanted to open up completely, but the words stuck in his throat. He watched her go, feeling like he was losing something he might never get back. That night, as Megan looked at the documents on her desk, she made a promise to herself. No matter how she felt about Mike, she wouldn't let it interfere with her search for the truth. Across town, Mike stared at his boxing gloves on the table, feeling more lost than ever. He knew that, at that moment, there were more than secrets between them. There was a distance he feared he would never be able to cross. The rain was falling in torrents in Manhattan, turning the streets into shining rivers under the streetlights. Mike was in the clandestine gym, the sound of blows echoing off the damp walls. He threw quick, precise punches at the punching bag, sweat dripping down his skin as he tried to focus on the rhythm of his breathing. Each blow felt like an attempt to drown out the voices in his mind, all of them saying the same thing: Megan. Since the confrontation in the cafe, her expression, full of disappointment and anger, had never left his mind. He knew he should have explained it better, but how can he explain something so complicated? His connection to the underground rings was not just a hobby or a sordid secret. It was something that was part of who he was, something that kept him connected to a past he still couldn't let go of. Eric entered the gym, crossing his arms as he watched Mike destroy the punching bag with a strength that seemed to go beyond the physical. That won't solve anything. Mike stopped, breathing heavily, but didn't turn around. What do you want? I want to know what you're going to do about Megan. Eric approached, taking a towel and throwing it to him. Because as far as I know, she won't just forget everything. Mike dried his face, tossing the towel aside. I know that. Then, are you going to let her believe that you are just a corrupt CEO and an illegal fighter? Mike sighed, resting his hands on his hips. I don't know how to fix this. Eric shook his head, frustrated. Maybe start by telling the truth. Mike was silent. The truth. It was easy for Eric to say, but the truth was too heavy to bear, especially when it involved not only his life, but the people he tried to protect. Across town, Megan sat in her small office, surrounded by documents and notes. Despite my frustration with Mike, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Something about his posture, the hesitant words he spoke, made her wonder if there was more to the story than she was able to see. You're wasting time, Megan, she muttered to herself, trying to push away her thoughts and focus on work. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just work. It was personal. The fact that Mike had messed with her so much made her furious, and the idea that he might be hiding something bigger than simple corruption made her even more determined to uncover the truth. That afternoon, Megan decided to return to the Reynolds Capital building, this time under the guise of reviewing more financial documents. While waiting at reception, he noticed a group of executives rushing into a meeting room. Their tense expressions and low-voiced conversations aroused his curiosity. Is there a problem? He asked the receptionist, trying to sound casual. The woman smiled nervously. Just an emergency meeting. Normal things for big companies. But Megan knew how to recognize when something was wrong. And when she saw Mike crossing the hallway toward the living room, his face carrying the same tension she had seen in others, her curiosity turned to concern. Inside the meeting room, Mike felt the air heavy as the executives discussed recent threats to the company. A corporate rival, Blackthorn Investments, appeared to be using inside information to sabotage important contracts. Additionally, there were rumors that someone within Reynolds Capital itself was providing confidential data. We need to find out who is behind this before things get worse, said one of the directors, his voice deep. Mike listened quietly, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew that the company was under attack, but he also knew that the biggest danger came from outside the corporate environment: the clandestine rings. Later, when he left the meeting, Mike found Megan in the hallway. She was standing still, arms crossed and an inquisitive look on her face. He hesitated for a moment before approaching. What are you doing here? He asked, trying to sound casual. Working, Megan replied, her tone dry. What is happening? Mike shook his head, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "Nothing that's any of your business." She took a step forward, narrowing her eyes. "Mike, don't start with that. I know there's something wrong, and it's not just with the company." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't tell you everything. Not now." "Then tell me what you can," she said, her voice softer than she intended. For a moment, Mike considered telling her, but he knew that anything he said now would only complicate things further. He needed to buy time. "Just trust me," he said finally. Megan laughed softly, humorlessly. "Trust is not something you earned with me, Mike." He didn't respond, just watched her as she walked away. He knew he was losing her, and the feeling was like a punch in the stomach. That night, back at his penthouse, Mike received a call from one of the organizers of the underground fights. The message was clear. Someone was threatening to expose the scheme, and Mike was in the crosshairs. "If this gets out, you know what will happen," said the man on the other end of the line. "I know," Mike replied, his voice firm, but inside he felt the weight of the choices he made. He couldn't let the rims destroy everything he had built, but he also couldn't abandon the people who depended on him. Meanwhile, Megan reviewed the most recent documents she had collected. The financial connections were becoming clearer and clearer, but now she was starting to see a pattern. It was as if the transactions weren't just about profit. There was something deeper, something that felt personal. "What are you hiding, Mike?" he muttered, while looking at a photo of him in one of the company's reports. The next day, Mike decided to look for her. He knew he needed to be honest, at least in part. He found her in the same cafe where they had argued before, but this time, his approach was different. "Megan, I know you have questions, and you have every right to be mad at me," he began, sitting down in front of her. She crossed her arms, looking at him suspiciously. "So why am I here?" "Because I need you to believe me when I say my intentions are good," he said, with a sincere tone. "What I'm doing in the ring is not about money or power. It's about something I need to finish." She watched him, trying to decide if she believed him. There was something in his voice, an urgency, that made her want to hear more. "Then tell me what it is," she said finally. "I can't, not yet. But when I can, I promise you'll be the first to know." Megan felt her heart waver. She wanted to believe him, but the doubts were still there, hanging like a cloud over her head. "That's not enough, Mike." He nodded, as if expecting that answer. "I know, but that's all I can offer right now." When she got up to leave, he took her arm, his touch gentle but firm. "Megan, just give me time." She looked at him for a moment before walking away without saying anything. Back in the gym that night, Mike knew time was running out. He needed to resolve the threats to his company, the ring, and most importantly, Megan. He just hoped that when everything was sorted out, she would still be there to listen to him. Megan's office was plunged into an uneasy silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of her fingers on the keyboard. The blue light from the monitor highlighted the dark circles under his eyes that marked his tired face, evidence of sleepless nights and uninterrupted hours of work. Around her, stacks of documents accumulated on the table, along with a cup of cold coffee, the aroma of which still lingered. Although mixed with the faint smell of paper and printer ink, his eyes, red from so much effort, scanned each line of financial data displayed on the screen, desperately searching for a pattern or clue that would tie together the pieces of the puzzle. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight. A series of suspicious transfers linked to shell companies repeatedly appeared in the records. However, what caught Megan's attention was the exact timing of these transactions. Each one coincided with important events at Reynolds Capital, such as signed contracts or announced audits. This was not a coincidence. Someone was using the company's legitimate operations to camouflage something much more sinister. She sighed, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her eyes. The cool texture of his fingers against his temples was comforting, but insufficient to ease the built-up tension. The physical exhaustion was a reflection of the emotional burden he carried: frustration, anger, and above all, an unshakable determination to get to the truth. She was so focused that she almost didn't notice when her cell phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up, displaying the name of Tom Benson, his boss. Megan felt her stomach tighten, a sign that something was wrong. She picked up the phone, noticing how her hands were slightly shaking. "Megan," Tom's voice sounded tense, almost a whisper. "We need to talk." "Now, Tom, what happened?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm, although he felt a chill run down his spine. "Not over the phone. Meet me at the Fifth Avenue coffee shop in 30 minutes. He hung up before she could question him, leaving her even more uneasy. Megan quickly grabbed her coat, feeling the cold fabric against her skin, and stepped out into the night air. The smell of freshly fallen rain filled the streets, mixed with the aroma of exhaust from cars rushing by. The yellowish lights from the streetlights reflected in the puddles of water, creating distorted patterns on the ground. When he arrived at the coffee shop, he found Tom sitting in an inconspicuous corner. He was leaning over the table, his hands clasped and his eyes fixed on nothing. When he saw her, he made a subtle gesture for her to sit down. "What is happening?" Megan asked, trying to decipher the serious and worried expression on Tom's face. He leaned forward, speaking quietly, as if he was afraid someone might hear them. "I discovered something, and honestly, I don't know if you should continue this investigation." Megan raised an eyebrow, surprised and suspicious. "Are you telling me to give up?" Tom sighed, running a hand over his face. The movement seemed to carry the weight of a burden he didn't want to share. "It's not that, but you need to understand that this goes beyond what we imagined. There are people involved who have nothing to lose, Megan." She crossed her arms, keeping her gaze fixed on him. "Who are these people?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door for a moment, as if expecting someone to enter. "I can't tell you, but I want you to be careful." The tone of his voice was genuine, almost paternal, but that only added to Megan's frustration. She knew he was trying to protect her, but giving up was never an option. When he returned home that night, he found an envelope stuck to the apartment door. The paper was thin, slightly wrinkled, with his name written in large, hurried letters. A shiver ran down her spine as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with simple but threatening words. "You're getting too close. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Megan felt her heart race. The note had a slightly metallic smell, as if it had been handled by sweaty hands or left out in the open. The threat was clear, but instead of fear, she felt something different, a burning determination. With his eyes fixed on the message, he took out his cell phone and typed a short but direct message. "We need to talk. Now." Across town, Mike sat in his car, parked in front of the gym where he usually spent his evenings. The familiar smell of leather and dust from the gym seemed to reach him, even from outside. He looked at his cell phone and saw Megan's message. For a moment, he considered ignoring her, but something inside him wouldn't allow it. He knew he couldn't run anymore. They met at a low-key bar in Brooklyn, the kind of place where no one would ask questions. Megan arrived first, choosing a table in the back, where the dim lighting created long shadows. She sat with her back straight, her hands crossed on the table, but her eyes betrayed the inner turmoil. When Mike walked in, their eyes met immediately. He walked towards her, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Megan felt a mixture of relief and anger when she saw him. "He sat across from you, his expression serious. You look desperate," he said, directly. "I received a threat," Megan replied, sliding the note across the table. Mike took the paper and read it, his jaw visibly clenching. The muscle in his jaw tightened, reflecting the growing tension. "This is serious," he said finally. "Who else knows about your investigation?" "Just my boss," Megan replied, crossing her arms. "But I don't think that's it. There's something bigger going on, and it's not just about Reynolds Capital." Mike looked at her for a moment, his dark eyes shining in the dim light. "Megan, you're dealing with people who play dirty. They have no limits." She looked at him, her gaze firm and defiant. "So tell me who they are, Mike." He hesitated, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of guilt. "These are people who use clandestine rings to launder money. My connection to the ring isn't just because I like fighting. I'm trying to take this apart from the inside." Megan was silent, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part was still wary. "And why didn't you tell me before?" she asked, her voice full of hurt. "Because the less you knew, the safer you would be." She snorted, shaking her head. Well, that plan clearly didn't work. Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but now we're in this together, whether you like it or not." Despite the tension, there was a growing complicity between them, something that they both tried to ignore, but that was impossible to deny. That night, as they returned to their respective homes, the cold air enveloped them, but their minds were warmed by a spark of something new, a bond, fragile but real, that pushed them inexorably towards a path of no return. The night was dense, and Manhattan seemed to breathe heavily under the dark sky dotted with clouds that hid the stars. Megan walked the streets with quick steps, the sound of her heels muffled by the damp asphalt. The cold wind cut into your face, bringing with it the smell of imminent rain mixed with the hot asphalt from the day before. She held her bag tightly, her fingers clenching the soft leather as her mind reviewed the events of the past few hours. After meeting Mike and revealing her intentions, Megan felt a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part, the more rational part, said she couldn't completely trust someone with so many secrets. Still, she couldn't ignore the sincere gleam in his eyes when he swore to protect her. The thought of Mike made her sigh as she walked around the corner towards her apartment building. The yellowish lights in the entrance hall seemed welcoming, a contrast to the cold, oppressive exterior. Megan squeezed her shoulders, trying to contain the shivers she felt. But something made her stop, a strange feeling, as if you were being watched. She looked around, her eyes scanning the empty street. Only the rustling of trees dancing in the wind and the distant roar of an engine broke the silence. Trying to shake off her paranoia, Megan entered the building, letting the glass door close with a slight click. However, as he climbed the narrow stairs, the discomfort remained. The faintly metallic smell of rust on the banister and the echo of his own footsteps seemed amplified. When he arrived at the door of his apartment, he noticed that something was out of place. The carpet in front of the entrance was slightly out of place. She froze, her heart racing as she tried to control her breathing. Was it possible that someone had been there? Her hands shook slightly as she looked for the key in her bag. Upon entering, she was greeted by silence, but not the comforting kind. It was a heavy silence, as if the air was waiting to be broken. Megan dropped her bag on the couch and began to walk around the room, analyzing every corner. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of danger persisted. She checked the windows, the door lock, and even the bedroom closet, trying to convince herself that everything was safe. When he returned to the living room, he noticed an envelope on the coffee table. He didn't remember leaving it there. His fingers hesitated before picking it up, the thick, scratchy paper feeling more threatening than it should have. When he opened it, he found a single sheet with a message typed in cold, mechanical letters. "You have been warned. Stop now, or it will be too late." The cold he felt when he read those words had nothing to do with the wind outside. She knew she was being followed, that the threat wasn't just symbolic. And the worst part, I was alone. Megan picked up the phone and dialed Mike's number, her heart racing as she waited for him to answer. "Megan?" Mike's hoarse and firm voice came from the other side, like an anchor in the midst of chaos. "Mike." She tried to sound calm, but her voice broke. "Someone was in my apartment." There was a tense silence before he responded. "Get out of there, now." "Where am I going?" she asked as she picked up her bag again and looked around, as if waiting for something or someone to come out of the shadows. "I'm coming to get you," he said, with a tone that left no room for discussion. Mike arrived at Megan's building in less than 15 minutes, his expression grim and determined. He wore a heavy black coat that seemed to absorb the darkness of the night, and his eyes glowed with an intensity Megan had never seen before. When he saw her coming down the stairs in a hurry, he walked towards her with firm steps, his shoulders tense and his hands stuck in his pockets, as if he was holding something he didn't want to let go. "Are you well?" he asked, his gaze scanning her from top to bottom, as if searching for any sign that something was wrong. "Yes, but..." She hesitated, feeling the adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. "I don't know what would have happened if I had arrived earlier." Mike clenched his jaw, fighting to stay calm. He placed a firm hand on your arm, the warmth of his touch contrasting with the cold around you. "I won't let anyone near you, Megan. Don't worry." He took her to his car, a black SUV with tinted windows that looked more like a mobile fortress. As they drove through the city, Megan watched his profile illuminated by the streetlights. There was a seriousness to his features, but also something softer, as if he were carrying a weight greater than she could imagine. "Where are we going?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. "To a safe place," Mike replied, without taking his eyes off the road. They arrived at a small boutique hotel on an inconspicuous street on the Upper West Side. The place was cozy, with a polished wooden reception desk and a faint scent of lavender in the air. Mike checked her in quickly and led her to a room on the second floor. "You will stay here for now," he said as he locked the door and checked the windows. "No one knows you're here, so you'll be safe." Megan watched him as he walked around the room, checking every detail with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. It was as if he was used to dealing with risky situations, something that made her wonder how much of his life he hadn't revealed yet. "Do you always do this?" she asked, trying to ease the tension. Mike stopped, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "Do what?" "Protect people," Megan replied, her voice softer now. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not always, but with you, it's different." The sincerity in his voice took Megan by surprise. She felt a wave of heat rise through her chest, but she also knew this wasn't the time to let her emotions get in the way. "Mike, what's going on?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Who's after me?" He hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. Finally, he sat down on the chair next to the window and faced her. "These are people who don't want you to find out what's going on behind the scenes at Reynolds Capital. And my connection to the underground rings doesn't help." Megan frowned, trying to process everything. "Did you know this could happen?" "I knew I was risking everything, but I didn't expect you to be involved like this," he said, his voice full of guilt. She walked over, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Mike, I need to know. Why are you doing this?" He looked away for a moment before responding. "Because it's not just about money or fights. It's about people. People who were harmed by the system, who were manipulated by these same names that appear in their reports." Megan felt a lump in her throat. Despite all the doubts I still had, I couldn't deny the passion and sincerity in his words. "And now, what do we do?" she asked, her voice firmer. Mike looked at her, his determination returning. "Now we work together to put an end to this. But most of all, I guarantee you will be fine." As he spoke, Megan noticed something that left her disconcerted. Mike wasn't just someone trying to redeem himself or protect his reputation. He really cared about her in a way she didn't expect. That night, while Megan tried to rest at the hotel, Mike remained outside the room, sitting in the hallway, his eyes fixed on the door like a guard. He knew the danger had not passed, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was fighting for something that really mattered. Morning came slowly, bringing a gray tone that seeped through the windows of the small hotel room where Megan was staying. The cold light of day didn't have the comforting warmth she expected. It was a harsh light that seemed to amplify his doubts and concerns. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the cup of coffee that Mike had brought from downstairs. The strong, bitter aroma filled the room, but it didn't do much to ease the knot in her stomach. Outside, Mike was leaning against the hallway wall, his arms crossed over his chest as his thoughts scrambled. He had spent the entire night on alert, sitting there, listening to every sound, analyzing every shadow that passed by the door. The tiredness was evident in his red eyes and tense face, but he didn't allow himself to rest. When Megan opened the door to call him, she found him in that position, like a watchful statue. His hair was slightly messy, and the black jacket seemed to be molded to his tired body. He looked up at her, and something in his expression made her hesitate. It wasn't just tiredness. It was weight, guilt, and a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "You need to rest," Megan said, crossing her arms. Mike shook his head, giving a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am fine. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." She narrowed her eyes, noticing the rigidity in his posture and the way he avoided looking at her directly. "You can't go on like this, Mike. There's no point in protecting me if you destroy yourself in the process." For a moment he didn't respond, but then he pushed away from the wall and entered the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly in the small space, and Megan felt her chest tighten at seeing him so dejected. "What's happening to you?" she asked, her voice softer now. Mike stood by the window, looking out at the drab view of the neighborhood. The falling raindrops made an uneven rhythm against the glass, but he seemed lost in thought. Finally, he sighed and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his frustration. "Megan, You deserve to know the truth," he said, without turning to face her. She took a step forward, feeling the air in the room change, as if something important was about to happen. "So tell me," he took a deep breath, as if preparing to carry a weight he had held for a long time. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were different, darker, more intense, as if he was exposing something he had never allowed anyone to see before. "Boxing was never just a hobby for me," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "It's the only place where I feel like I have control." Megan frowned, trying to understand. Control over what? Mike gave a small, sad smile, shaking his head. "About life, about myself. When I'm in the ring, everything disappears. It doesn't matter who I am or what I've done. It's just me, the opponent, and the blows I give or receive. It's pure." There was a moment of silence between them, broken only by the sound of the rain getting heavier outside. Megan could see he was struggling to find the right words, something that wasn't common for someone like Mike. "When I was younger, my life was chaos. My dad left us, my mom worked all the time, and well, I wasn't exactly a role model." He laughed humorlessly, looking at the floor. "Boxing was what saved me. It was what gave me discipline, purpose." Megan approached him slowly, feeling a lump form in her throat as she heard the sincerity in his voice. "And the clandestine rings?" she asked, trying not to sound accusatory. Mike looked up at her, and this time there was raw pain in his expression. "I didn't start by choice. I started because I needed to. First, it was money to survive. Then it became something bigger. A way to help others like me who had nowhere to go." She noticed he was clenching his hands, his knuckles white against his skin. His voice became quieter, almost a whisper. "But that's when I got involved with the wrong people. People who saw the rings as an opportunity to make a lot of money, to exploit those who just wanted to fight to have a chance." Megan felt a shiver run down her spine, but it wasn't from fear. It was compassionate. She began to see a side of Mike that she never imagined. A man who, despite his flaws, seemed to be trying to do something right in a world that had always been against him. "So you got stuck," she said, more like a statement than a question. Mike nodded, his gaze fixed on hers. "And now, I'm trying to leave. But it's not that simple. These people won't let anyone leave without paying the price." Megan took a deep breath, trying to process everything. It felt like a veil had been lifted, revealing the complexity of who Mike really was. But at the same time, it raised more questions than it answered. "What about Reynolds Capital? How does this fit in?" she asked, her voice firm again. He looked away, looking guilt-ridden once again. "I used the company to mask some of the operations. It wasn't for me. It was to protect the people who depend on the rings. But I know it was wrong." She was silent, trying to take it all in. She felt angry that he had hidden so much, but she also couldn't ignore the vulnerability with which he opened himself to her. It was impossible not to feel like he was struggling, maybe for the first time, to be completely honest. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally. Mike took a step towards her, and Megan felt the air in the room change again, as if everything had become denser. "Because you deserve to know. And because," he stopped, struggling with the words, "because you're the only person who can make me believe that there's still a way out of this without destroying everything." His gaze was so sincere that Megan felt the ground move beneath her feet. She didn't know if she could trust him completely, but at the same time, something inside her made her want to try. "Mike, I don't know what that means," she said, her voice softer. He gave a small smile, but there was a sadness there. "Me either. But I know that as long as you're involved, I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." Megan didn't respond, but the silence that followed between them was more meaningful than any words could be. That night, as Mike stood guard outside her room again, Megan looked out the window at the falling rain and felt something shift inside her. She knew there were still many questions to be answered, but now, for the first time, she saw Mike as more than a troubled CEO or an underground fighter. He was a broken man, trying to find the right path. The air was heavy the morning Megan received the email. She was sitting at the table of the small cafe in Midtown Manhattan, trying to process the information that appeared on her screen. The aroma of freshly ground grain filled the room, but it wasn't enough to calm the agitation within her. The email, sent by an anonymous source, contained attachments with detailed documents that appeared to link a person close to her to the Reynolds Capital money laundering scheme. Her heart raced as she went through each line, her eyes burning from reading and rereading the information. The numbers were clear, the transactions undeniable. She didn't want to believe it, but everything pointed to Tom Benson, his longtime boss and mentor, the one who had always insisted that she be careful, who seemed to want to protect her, now appeared as a central piece in the scheme she was trying to dismantle. The betrayal burned like an open wound. She tried to remember every conversation, every gesture, trying to find the signs she should have noticed. There were little details like Tom's discomfort whenever the name Reynolds Capital came up, or the way he seemed to insist that she avoid delving too deeply. Now everything made sense, but that didn't make the pain any less. The coffee she held in her hand shook slightly, and Megan realized she was squeezing the cup hard enough to almost break it. Taking a deep breath, he placed it on the table and tried to calm his thoughts. She needed more concrete evidence, something that would confirm the information in the email before confronting him. Across town, Mike was in the gym, training for a fight he couldn't avoid. The air was hot and charged, the smell of sweat and rubber from the equipment permeating the room. He was alone in the ring, his fists wrapped in white bandages already stained red. With each punch on the punching bag, he tried to dispel the restlessness that was growing inside him. Eric entered the gym with hurried steps, wearing an expression that Mike recognized immediately: concern. "We have a problem," he said, holding an envelope in his hands. Mike stopped, taking a deep breath before picking up the envelope and opening it. Inside was a photo of the man who would be his next opponent. Was Victor Novak, a fighter known both for his brutality and his lack of scruples. Mike felt a chill run down his spine when he saw Victor's scarred face and cruel smile. "He was hired," continued Eric, crossing his arms. "And it's not just for the fight. They want to intimidate you, maybe hurt you enough to get you out of the way." Mike tossed the photo onto the nearby table, his face impassive. But Eric knew that inside he was analyzing every detail, calculating every possibility. "I can't back down," Mike said finally, his voice low but firm. Eric huffed, frustrated. "We're not talking about just any fight, Mike. This guy doesn't play fair, and you already have enough problems." Mike looked at him, eyes shining with a determination that Eric recognized well. "It's not just about me. It's about everything that's at stake." That night, as the city glowed under artificial lights, Megan returned to the office with renewed purpose. She needed to confront Tom, but first, she gathered all the evidence she could. The familiar smell of old coffee and paper permeated the room, and the sound of the keyboard echoed through the empty room. When he finally felt like he had enough, he got up and went to Tom's room. He was sitting at his desk, glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed papers. When he saw her enter, he smiled, but Megan noticed that the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Megan, long afternoon?" he asked, pointing to the chair in front of him. She didn't respond immediately, just sat down and placed the envelope with the documents on the table. Tom frowned, picking it up carefully. As he opened it and started reading, his expression changed. First, surprise, then something that seemed to be a mixture of frustration and resignation. "What is this, Tom?" Megan asked, her voice firm but full of emotion. He sighed, putting the papers aside. "Megan, it's not what it seems." "Isn't it what it seems?" She laughed, but the sound was full of disbelief. "You are involved in this. The transfers, the shell companies, everything leads to you." Tom took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if the weight of everything was finally bearing down on him. "I had no choice." Megan leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Everyone has a choice, Tom. You chose to betray everything we worked for." He looked at her, his eyes tired. "You don't understand. These people, they're not like us. No matter what we do, they always win. I was just trying to survive." Megan felt a surge of anger and sadness. She wanted to scream, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the reality was that he didn't even seem to try to fight it. "I thought I could trust you," she said, her voice low but full of hurt. Tom didn't respond, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Megan stood up, picking up the documents. "I'm not going to let this go." As she left the room, she felt as if something inside her had broken. At the same time, in the clandestine gym, Mike was preparing to enter the ring against Victor. The atmosphere was buzzing with anticipation. The smell of cigarettes and alcohol mixing with the sweat of the screaming crowd around the ring. Victor was already there, looking at Mike like a predator watching its prey. When the fight started, Mike knew immediately that Eric was right. Victor wasn't there to fight. It was there to destroy. Every blow he delivered was full of brute force, without technique, but with the clear intention of hurting. Mike dodged, trying to maintain his composure, but felt the impact of the punches that managed to hit him. The heat of the blood dripping from his brow made his eyes burn, and the sound of the crowd was like a constant roar in his ears. But he didn't give up. With every blow, with every dodge, he remembered why he was there, everything that was at stake. When he finally found an opening, he delivered a precise punch to Victor's jaw, which fell with a crash, silencing the crowd. As Victor was removed from the ring, Mike remained in the center, breathing heavily, but with his fists still raised. He knew that this fight was not the end, but just the beginning of something even bigger. Megan, when she returned home that night, felt exhausted but determined. She knew she was now closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. As she looked at the Manhattan skyline, the lights shining against the darkness, she thought about Mike and how intertwined their lives were. Even if she didn't want to admit it, the Manhattan sky looked like an ever-changing painting, the orange and purple tones merging with the first lights that began to shine in the building's windows. The icy wind whipped through the busy streets, whipping Megan's hair, which danced around her face like unruly strands. She pulled her coat tighter against her body, trying to contain the cold that seemed to not only come from outside, but also from within. His chest felt tight, thoughts spinning in his mind like a runaway merry-go-round. Every step she took towards the cafe felt heavier, as if a part of her was hesitant to face what was coming. The recent confrontation with Tom, the web of lies surrounding Reynolds Capital, and, most importantly, Mike's duality, all seemed to conspire to leave her in a state of constant doubt. She needed answers, but more than that, she needed clarity. Upon entering the cafe, she was greeted by the cozy warmth of the space and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the slightly sweet smell of croissants that were displayed in a lighted display case. The conversations around were soft, creating an almost relaxing ambient sound, but Megan barely registered them. Her eyes found Mike sitting by the window, and she stopped for a moment to observe him. He had his coat off, hanging on the chair next to him, and was wearing a long-sleeved shirt that framed his broad shoulders. His hair was still damp, probably from a recent shower, and a few strands fell across his forehead. The soft light of the cafe highlighted the contours of his face, his tense jaw and distant gaze, as if he carried an invisible weight. A cup of coffee rested untouched on the table, the strong aroma rising in delicate spirals that matched the bitter expression he was trying to hide. Megan took a deep breath before walking over to him, her heels making a muffled sound on the wooden floor. When she got close, he looked up, and a small smile curved his lips. But the smile didn't reach her eyes, which were dark, filled with something she couldn't completely decipher. "You came," he said, pulling out the chair for her with a slow, almost hesitant gesture. "I couldn't ignore it," Megan replied, her voice controlled but full of emotion. She sat down, adjusting her jacket on her lap, while Mike leaned back in his chair again. The silence that followed was dense, filled with unspoken words. The clinking of cups in the background and the low sound of laughter seemed to come from a distant world. "How are you after everything?" he asked finally, his voice low, almost as if he feared the answer. Megan crossed her arms, her posture rigid, as if trying to protect herself from the emotional impact of that moment. "That depends. Will you tell me what's really going on?" Mike ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a reflection of nervousness. His fingers slid slowly, making the strands messier. "I thought I already explained. You explained part of it. But there's always more, isn't there?" she replied, leaning slightly forward, her eyes fixed on his, daring him to be honest. He held her gaze for a moment, but the intensity in Megan's eyes seemed to penetrate his defenses. Finally, he turned away, looking at the table. "Megan, I can't tell you everything. Not yet." She felt her stomach drop, a tight lump forming in her throat. Frustration mixed with heartache creating a storm that seemed ready to explode. Always that. I can't right now. It's complicated. You say you want to protect me, but you keep hiding things. Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and his voice sounded more urgent. Because I'm trying to do this the right way. I don't want you to get hurt any more than you already are. Megan took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, as she tried to contain the wave of emotions that threatened to spill over. When he opened his eyes, his voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a scream. And you think this is helping me? There was a silence that seemed to last an eternity. Mike looked away, staring at the window where the car lights created dancing reflections on the glass. He seemed to be fighting something inside himself, something he didn't know how to express. When he finally looked at her again, his expression had changed. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, but also a determination. I never chose this, Megan, he said, his voice hoarse. But now I'm here, and I can't just abandon everything. She felt the ground move beneath her feet. His words were like a blow, each one heavier than the last. So that's it. You choose to stay in this world. Mike shook his head, running his hand over the back of his neck as if to ease the tension. It's not that simple. It is not. Megan laughed, but the sound was hollow, humorless. It seems pretty simple to me. You're so focused on saving this world of yours that you don't even realize what you're missing. Her words hit Mike like a punch in the gut, but he didn't respond right away. Megan watched his expression harden, the eyes that once held vulnerability now cold, as if he were putting up a wall between them. Maybe you're right, he said finally, his voice low, almost emotionless. Megan felt her heart sink. She expected him to challenge her, to say something to convince her that it was worth continuing to believe in him. But all he got was that empty response. She stood up, grabbing her coat with a sudden movement. Maybe I am, she replied, turning to leave before he could see the tears that were beginning to form in her eyes. Mike watched her as she walked away, the sound of her footsteps echoing in his mind long after she had left the cafe. He wanted to run after her, grab her and tell her that she was more important than anything, but the words stuck in his throat, suffocated by the weight of his choices. Megan stepped out into the cold night, the wind cutting into her skin like little knives, but the pain in her chest was so much worse. Her hands shook as she clutched her coat to her body, trying to contain the tears that insisted on escaping. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning in his lungs, but he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. As he walked through the brightly lit streets, the sounds of the city around him were drowned out by his own thoughts. The pain was throbbing, an open wound that she knew would take time to heal. In the cafe, Mike sat for a long time, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of him. Megan's every word echoed in her mind, every accusation and every disappointment. He knew he had failed her, but he couldn't find a way to justify his choices without destroying her even more. Later that night, as Megan stared at the ceiling of her dark apartment and Mike threw punches at the punching bag in the empty gym, they both felt the weight of the distance that had grown between them. Despite being separated, there was an invisible thread that still connected them, a bond that neither of them knew how to sever. And deep down, they both wondered if what they had lost could still be recovered. Dawn arrived in pale shades of blue and gray, the kind of sky that precedes a storm. Mike stood on the terrace of his penthouse, coatless, with the cold wind biting his skin as he looked down at the city below. Manhattan never slept, but that morning it seemed quieter, as if it were on hold. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning in his lungs, but the physical discomfort was a welcome relief from the whirlwind of thoughts that consumed him. The conversation with Megan continued to echo in his mind. Her every word seemed burned into his memory. She was right, he was wrong, and for the first time, he admitted it to himself. The choice he had been postponing, the abandonment he knew was necessary, finally seemed unpossible. The clandestine ring had always been more than a refuge. It was a place where he felt alive, but it was also a trap, a shadow that threatened to consume everything he tried to protect, including Megan. And now, with her out of his life, he saw clearly what he needed to do. Eric appeared in the doorway, his eyes worried as he held a steaming cup of coffee. "It's too cold to be out there without a coat, Mike," he said, entering the terrace. Mike didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Finally, he turned around, his eyes tired but determined. "I need to get out of the ring, Eric." The shock on his friend's face was evident. He set down his coffee, crossing his arms. "Are you serious?" "I've never been so serious," Mike replied, his voice firm but without arrogance. Eric shook his head in disbelief. "And how do you think it will turn out? These people won't just let you go." Mike ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his frustration. "I don't know yet, but I'll find out. I can't go on with this." Eric sighed, but deep down he knew Mike had already made his decision. He knew that determined look. While Mike was planning his exit, Megan was in her apartment, surrounded by papers and documents. The smell of strong coffee filled the air, mixed with the soft scent of her favorite lavender candle, which was burning on a corner of the table. She had spent a sleepless night trying to find the ultimate connection between Reynolds, Capital's financial schemes, and those responsible for manipulating them. As he turned another page, something caught his attention. It was an email sent by mistake from one of the company's internal servers. The sender was a name she recognized, Tom Benson. The message, although brief, mentioned a confidential meeting with a third party, whose identity was not revealed, but the content indicated something compromising. Megan felt her heart speed up. This email was more than a clue. It was proof, something concrete that could be used to expose Tom and maybe even clear Mike's name. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on her laptop screen as adrenaline pumped through her veins. Picking up her phone, she quickly dialed a contact at the Financial Crimes Bureau, someone she trusted to validate the information and help connect her to the case. As he waited on the line, he looked out the window at the city outside. There was a renewed energy in his chest, a determination that rivaled anything he had ever felt. On the other side of the city, Mike was in a cramped room in the underground gym, facing the leader of the scheme. The air was heavy, permeated with the smell of cigarettes and sweat. The man in front of him, an ordinary-looking businessman with eyes as cold as ice, stared at Mike with a mix of surprise and irritation. "Do you want to go out?" he asked, an incredulous smile appearing on his thin lips. "You know it doesn't work like that." Mike crossed his arms, posture firm. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm saying I'm out." The man laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed through the room. "Do you think you can just leave? After everything you were part of? You are a valuable asset, Mike. I can't let you go. I'm not giving you another option." Mike replied, his voice low but full of strength. "This ends here." The tension in the room was palpable, but Mike didn't back down. He knew this decision could be costly, but he was willing to pay the price. Meanwhile, Megan reviewed documents with her contact, feeling like she was finally reaching the end of a maze that seemed endless. The final piece was almost in place, but something was bothering her. She knew Mike was at the center of it all, but there were still doubts about his true intention. Later that night, Megan and Mike unexpectedly meet at the Reynolds Capital building. She was there to deliver the evidence to the company's legal department, while he was finishing a meeting to formalize his departure from the clandestine business. When their eyes met in the lobby, they both stopped, as if time had frozen for an instant. Megan was the first to speak, her voice hesitant. "What are you doing here?" Mike gave a small smile, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Finishing something." "And you?" She held the documents in her hand, feeling their weight. "Doing the same." There was a charged silence between them, but this time, it wasn't accusatory. It was something more complex, something neither of them could put into words. "Megan," Mike began, taking a step towards her. "I know you think I chose the worst path, but I'm trying to fix that." She looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of emotions. "And I found something that might help." They stared at each other, the sound of the air conditioning filling the space between the words neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Megan handed him the documents. "This might prove that you weren't involved in the darker parts of it all, but it will only work if you are really willing to change." Mike took the papers, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. "I am," he said, his voice firm. That moment was brief, but full of meaning. They both knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Later that night, as Mike reviewed documents in his penthouse and Megan returned home, feeling like something was finally moving in the right direction, They both felt an invisible thread connecting them again. It was tenuous, fragile, but it was there. Night fell over Manhattan with an unsettling air. The sky was dark, starless, as if a curtain of shadows had descended over the city. The cold wind blew through the streets, lifting papers and spreading the metallic smell of the rain that threatened to fall. In a warehouse on the less glamorous side of town, fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, partially illuminating the claustrophobic interior. Mike was in the makeshift locker room, sitting on a worn wooden bench, his hands bandaged and his elbows resting on his thighs. The air was heavy with the smell of old sweat and wood oil, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on an indistinct spot on the ground, as his mind spun between recent memories and what he was about to face. Eric entered the room with hurried steps, carrying the weight of tension in his expression. He held a damp cloth in one hand and a bottle of water in the other. "Mike, I still think this is a terrible idea." Mike looked up slowly, his muscles tensing as his jaw clenched. "It's not an idea, it's a must." Eric huffed in frustration, throwing the cloth onto the bench next to Mike. "Is there no other way? They're using you, Mike. This is not about honor. It is not about fighting. It's about control." Mike ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair, leaving the strands in disarray. "It's not about me this time. It's for Liam. He'll never get out of this if I don't do this." The name brought a wave of conflicting emotions to Mike's face. Liam was a young fighter he had trained, someone who had fallen in with the wrong people at the wrong time. He wasn't just a promising talent, was someone Mike saw as a younger version of himself, full of potential, but on the verge of being destroyed by a corrupt system. Eric sighed, shaking his head as he leaned against the peeling wall. "You know they won't let you leave even after this, don't you?" Mike stood up, snapping his fingers as if preparing his body and mind for the battle to come. "Then they'll have to drag me away." Across town, Megan sat in her living room, surrounded by a pile of papers and notes. The laptop in front of her displayed emails confirming the next steps to hand over the evidence to the Financial Crimes Bureau. Everything seemed to be falling into place, but something was bothering her. A nagging feeling that there was something she was missing. When her phone vibrated on the table, she absently picked it up. It was a message from an unknown number, but the content made his heart skip a beat. "Mike's in a fight. He's not going to get out of this in one piece. You can stop it." The blood drained from his face as he read the message over and over, trying to process the words. The air seemed to have grown heavier, and the soft scent of the candle she had lit hours ago now felt suffocating. Without thinking much, she grabbed her coat and keys, heading out into the cold night. The taxi she took seemed to move too slowly as she gave the address of the warehouse. The car's engine was roaring, and the slightly burning smell of the upholstery made her stomach turn. But she couldn't think about anything other than getting there on time. In the warehouse, the fight had already started. The sound of the crowd's screams was deafening, a mixture of excitement and violence that filled the space like a pulsating wave. Bright white lights illuminated the makeshift ring, where Mike and his opponent were in a fierce confrontation. Victor Novak, the same man who had faced Mike before, was back. He was a mountain of muscle, with a predatory gaze that made the crowd shudder with every movement. His tattoos covering his arms and chest glowed under the lights, and each blow he delivered felt heavier than the last. Mike, on the other hand, was a mix of strength and strategy. His strikes were precise, his dodges quick, but the tiredness in his eyes betrayed something that the crowd might not realize. He wasn't just there to win. He was fighting to protect something bigger. When Megan entered the warehouse, the smell of cigarettes and beer hit her like a slap. She pushed her way through the crowd, her desperate eyes searching for Mike. When she finally saw him in the ring, she felt a mixture of relief and terror. He was struggling, but the blows he was taking made her shiver as if she were feeling them. "Mike!" she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the crowd. In the ring, Mike heard the muffled sound of his name, but he couldn't be distracted. He blocked a blow from Victor, feeling the impact reverberate through his arm, and countered with a right hook that sent his opponent staggering back. The fight was brutal, and with each blow, Megan felt a part of herself want to run into the ring and get him out. The smell of blood and sweat seemed stronger now, and the heat of the room made her skin burn, but she couldn't look away. When the round ended, Mike returned to his corner, breathing heavily as Eric pressed a towel to a cut above his eyebrow. It was then that he saw Megan. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse and full of disbelief. "Saving you from yourself," Megan replied, her gaze fixed on his, her eyes shining with tears that she refused to let fall. Mike closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a wave of emotions hit him harder than any blow Victor had dealt. When he opened it again, there was a renewed determination in his gaze. "I need to finish this," he said, his voice low but firm. Megan held his arm, her fingers pressing into his skin as if she could hold him there forever. "Then finish, but come back in one piece." In the final round, Mike fought like never before. He used every ounce of strength and strategy, every lesson he had learned over the years. When he finally dropped Victor with a devastating cross, the crowd's momentary silence was followed by an explosion of screams. Mike fell to his knees in the center of the ring, breathing heavily as he looked at Megan in the crowd. She smiled, a small smile, but full of meaning. Later, as they walked out of the warehouse together, Megan finally broke the silence. "That was the last time, right?" Mike looked at her, his face still marked from the fight, but his eyes shone with something else. Relief. "Last time, I promise." And for the first time, Megan believed him. The sound of screams and applause seemed to take on a life of its own, reverberating through the warehouse's concrete walls like a deafening wave that didn't let up. The air was heavy, permeated with the acrid smell of cigarettes mixed with the bitter sweetness of spilled beer and the salty smell of sweat that seemed to hover in the room. The space, lit only by fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, cast dancing shadows on the graffiti-covered walls and the makeshift ring in the center. The crowd swarmed around, a tight mass of sweaty faces and hungry eyes, surrounding the ring like vultures around falling prey. The energy in the air was almost palpable, a dangerous mix of excitement and aggression that seemed to run down the walls of the place. In the center of the chaos, Mike stood still, a statue of strength and determination. His broad shoulders were tense, and the sweat that ran down his face mixed with the dried blood that marked his eyebrow. The bandages on his hands, dyed red, told the story of blows given and received. Each heavy breath seemed to echo in his ears, momentarily drowning out the sound of the surrounding crowd. His eyes, fixed on his opponent, were fiercely bright, but there was something else there, a shadow of weariness and an echo of doubts. On the other side, his opponent was a wall of muscle and tattoos, a man so large he seemed to take up more space than he was allowed. He paced back and forth like a bull about to charge, his gaze fixed on Mike, charged with silent menace. Mike knew this fight wasn't like the others. It wasn't just for his reputation or for money. There was something much bigger at stake. He glanced quickly toward the corner, where Liam, a thin, wide-eyed young man, was leaning against the wall. The boy seemed shrunken, almost trying to disappear into the shadows. His eyes were full of fear and guilt, and Mike felt the weight of responsibility tighten in his chest even more. He couldn't back down. The doorbell rang, a shrill sound that cut through the air and sent the warehouse into an even greater frenzy. Mike's opponent advanced with heavy steps that made the wooden floor creak. The first blow came fast and precise, hitting Mike's abdomen with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. He staggered, but didn't fall. Recovering, he dodged the next attack with the agility of someone who knew his opponent's every move before they were even made. Outside, Megan got out of the taxi hurriedly, her heart hammering in her chest as if she wanted to escape. The phone was still in his hand, the anonymous message open on the screen. "Mike is in danger." The words seemed to vibrate before her eyes, a mix of panic and urgency pushing her forward. She opened the warehouse door and was greeted by a wave of muggy heat and the metallic smell of oil mixed with rusty metal. The environment was claustrophobic, full of sweaty bodies pushing each other to get a better view of the ring. Megan felt a shiver run down her spine, but she remained focused. His gaze quickly found Mike, and for a moment, everything around him disappeared. He was fighting with an almost brutal intensity, each movement a mix of strength and strategy, but she could see he was on edge. His blows were still accurate, but there was something in the way he moved, a tiredness, a slowness that shouldn't be there. "Mike," she shouted, her voice desperate. but the sound was swallowed by the cacophony of the crowd. In the ring, Mike barely heard his name, lost in the battle against his opponent, who was advancing like a locomotive. He blocked a blow that would have hit his face and responded with a cross that made his opponent falter. For a moment, he felt the advantage, but then something strange happened. Megan saw it before Mike. A man in the crowd climbed into the ring, moving too quickly to be noticed by the others. He was wearing a heavy coat and had something shining in his hand, a gun, small but lethal. Panic gripped Megan, an intense cold creeping up her spine. Without thinking, she started pushing people, her body moving almost on instinct. The man raised his arm, pointing the gun directly at Mike. Megan arrived on time. "Mike, be careful," she shouted, throwing herself at her attacker with all the strength she could muster. The impact was enough to deflect the man's arm, and the sound of a gunshot echoed through the warehouse, making time seem to freeze. The projectile hit the corner of the ring, sparking sparks and eliciting screams from the crowd. Chaos took over the place. People ran everywhere, pushing each other to get away. Mike turned around in time to see Megan fighting the gunman, her small figure facing something much larger. The world around him seemed to slow down, and he ran toward her, his body moving before his mind could process. With strength he didn't even know he had, he grabbed the man by the collar and threw him against the ground. The weapon fell from his hand with a metallic clang, sliding across the ring floor. Megan fell to her knees, panting, her arms shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. Mike knelt beside her, hands on her shoulders, eyes full of concern, and something that seemed so deep it made Megan feel a lump in her throat. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Megan nodded, trying to catch her breath. "I needed to come. I couldn't let you do this alone." He pulled her close, wrapping her in a hug so tight that he seemed to want to protect her from everything. The heat of his body contrasted with the cold that seemed to emanate from the ring floor, and Megan felt the tears finally flow, relieving the tension that seemed to consume her since the moment she received that message. "I almost lost you," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. Megan pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes meeting his. "And I almost lost you. You can't keep putting yourself in danger like this, Mike." He cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears running down her cheeks. "I promise, Megan," he finished. "I'm going to get out of this, and I'm going to do it for you." She shook her head, her voice shaking with the intensity of her emotions. "Do this for yourself too. You deserve more." The two looked at each other, the chaos around them becoming an insignificant blur. When Mike leaned in and their lips met, the kiss was soft but filled with promise. It was as if they were both trying to say everything that words couldn't express. Later, as they walked out of the warehouse together, the distant sound of police sirens echoed through the air. Mike kept his arm around Megan, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone anymore. The morning arrived with cruel clarity, as if the clear blue sky mocked the turmoil Megan felt inside. The sun shone high, bathing Manhattan in golden tones that reflected off the windows of the skyscrapers. But for her, there was nothing radiant about that day. The cold autumn wind bit into her skin, even through her tightly fitted coat, and the sound of hurried footsteps on the sidewalks mixed with the distant noise of traffic. Everything around him seemed a blur as his focus remained on the briefcase he held tightly to his chest. Inside the folder, the documents that tied up every loose thread, that unmasked the truth behind the shell companies, the manipulation of contracts, and the money laundering scheme. But along with the evidence came the weight of responsibility. Each step toward the Financial Crimes Bureau building felt heavier than the last. Upon entering the building, the familiar and unpleasant aroma of bitter coffee mixed with the dry smell of old paper enveloped her, bringing a feeling of uncomfortable familiarity. The neutral-toned walls and worn metal furniture reinforced the impersonal atmosphere of the place. The fluorescent lamps above cast a cold white light, which made the room even more sterile. Megan took a deep breath, adjusting her posture and straightening her shoulders. There was no room for hesitation now. The hallway seemed endless as she walked towards the conference room. The sound of your heels on the linoleum floor echoed softly, rhythmic like your heartbeat. He passed framed motivational posters that spoke of justice and integrity, but the words rang hollow at that moment. She knew that when she opened that door, she would be confronting not only a corrupt system, but also a man who had been her mentor and trusted. As she entered the room, she felt the weight of the eyes on her. The atmosphere was stuffy, as if the air carried the collective tension of the people there. Legal representatives, agents, and analysts occupied chairs around the long, pale wood table, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. In the center, like an authority figure, stood Tom Benson. He looked comfortable, with a slight smile that barely disguised the arrogance in his eyes. "Megan," he said, his voice low and controlled, but carrying a condescending tone. "I hope you have something convincing to share with us." Megan felt her stomach turn when she heard that voice that had guided her so many times. But it was no longer time to hesitate. She placed the folder on the table, her hands slightly shaking as she opened the clasps. As he revealed the meticulously organized documents, his voice sounded firm, almost defiant. "These are the financial data and correspondence that prove the involvement of third parties in the money laundering scheme and manipulation of contracts linked to Reynolds Capital." The room fell into silence, broken only by the sound of papers being leafed through. Megan watched each reaction carefully, her eyes catching the slight frown in some and the obvious shock in others. But what caught her attention most was Tom. He maintained his composure, but Megan noticed the almost imperceptible movement of his hand, shaking slightly as he held a pen. "How were these documents obtained?" an agent asked, looking up at her, suspicion evident in his tone. Megan responded firmly, keeping her gaze straight, cross-checking internal records that were left vulnerable on poorly protected servers. "That's how I discovered Tom Benson's direct involvement." Tom let out a short laugh, a dry sound that echoed through the room. He leaned forward, the smile on his lips now tighter. "Megan, this is a serious mistake. You are accusing the person who has guided you throughout your career. I hope there is more than coincidences to base these claims on." Megan didn't waver. With a controlled movement, he slid another document toward the agents. "Here's his signature on a transfer to an offshore account registered in the name of one of the shell companies, a company directly linked to the falsified contracts that put Reynolds Capital at risk." The expressions around the table changed, the more discreet reactions now turning into visible tension. Tom tried to maintain his posture, but Megan saw the mask of confidence slip for an instant. His eyes shifted away, and the movement of his hand became more visible. "That doesn't prove anything," he said, his voice louder but unstable. "It could be anyone with access to my credentials." Megan took a deep breath, feeling the moment to deliver the final blow. "That is true," she said, pausing to create suspense. "But I also have records of calls, emails, and even a recording of a meeting where you discussed the details of the operation." She took a flash drive out of her pocket, placing it on the table. An agent took it and connected it to a laptop. The audio started playing, and Tom's voice echoed through the room, clear and unmistakable. He was arguing with someone about how to mask transactions and embezzle funds. The change in the room was immediate. The air became thicker, the expressions of those present varying between shock and indignation. Tom turned pale, his confidence evaporating in front of everyone. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. "That's not," he began, but his voice trailed off. One of the agents stood up, walking towards him with firm steps. "Tom Benson, you are under arrest on suspicion of financial fraud and money laundering conspiracy." The sound of the handcuffs closing on Tom's wrists was almost deafening to Megan. As he was let out, she felt a wave of relief mixed with a bitter taste. That was a victory, but it came at a high cost. The loss of trust he had once placed in someone he considered an important figure in his life. Later, at Reynolds Capital, the atmosphere seemed different. The building, with its imposing facade of glass and gleaming steel, seemed more welcoming now that the truth had been revealed. The fresh smell of the lobby, mixed with the light citrus scent of flowers in an arrangement near the reception, seemed to match the feeling of renewal Megan felt. Mike was waiting for her at the entrance, dressed casually, but with the confident posture that had always defined him. His eyes lit up when he saw her approach, and a small but sincere smile curved his lips. "You did it." Megan felt a warmth rise in her chest, and for the first time that day, a real smile appeared on her face. "We did it," She handed him a copy of the documents proving her innocence. Mike flipped through the pages, his eyes taking in every detail before looking up at her. "I don't know how to thank you." Megan stepped forward, holding his hand, his warmth comforting her. "No need to thank me, Mike. Just make it count." For a moment, they stood there, the distant voices and footsteps of the people around them, creating a barely audible background. The gentle wind made Megan's hair dance, and the sun shone on her skin. "What happens now?" he asked finally. Megan smiled softly, her eyes shining with determination. "Now it's your turn to decide how you're going to write the next chapter of your story." Mike nodded, a gleam of determination in his eyes. He knew there was a lot of work ahead, but when he looked at Megan, he knew he was no longer alone. "And that was all I needed to get started." The morning sun invaded the large windows of the boxing gym, creating golden patterns on the worn wooden floor, which gleamed with the light of the new day. Dust motes danced in the air, visible beneath the warm rays, while the space resonated with a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional creaking of ropes in the empty ring. The familiar smell of old leather mixed with the subtle scent of magnesium coming from the weight bars, forming an unmistakable fragrance that Mike associated with dedication and hard work. He was standing near the ring, holding a cup of freshly purchased coffee that emanated delicate steam with a strong, full-bodied aroma. He wore a gray t-shirt that highlighted his broad shoulders and the defined contour of his arms, and black sweatpants that fit comfortably over his sneakers. The clean bandages he held in his other hand hadn't yet been used, but he could already feel the weight of the training to come. Mike stared at the empty ring, his brown eyes reflecting a mixture of nostalgia and determination. For months, that space had been a refuge, a place where he could vent his anger and frustration. Now it represented something bigger, a fresh start, a chance to do things legitimately. The sound of footsteps echoed through the gym, and Eric entered carrying a bulky briefcase, his expression a combination of pride and slight concern. "Here it is," he said, throwing the folder onto a nearby chair. "Contracts, licenses, everything you need to start your legitimate career." Mike picked up the folder carefully, feeling the weight, not just physical, but symbolic of what it represented. He opened the pages, reading carefully, his eyes taking in every detail. It was the fulfillment of a promise, something he had sworn to Megan and himself that he would do. "It looks official," he said, allowing himself a small smile. "Because it is," Eric replied, crossing his arms and leaning against a wall. "But tell me one thing. Are you really ready for this? Without shortcuts, without clandestine struggles, without anything from the past?" Mike looked up, his eyes shining with a determination that Eric hadn't seen in a long time. "I've never been so ready." Meanwhile, across town, Megan was in her new office, where the smell of new furniture and freshly printed paper still hung in the air. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows, illuminating the discreet sign at the entrance that read Carter and Associados Financial and Investigative Consulting. The room had a modern design, with personal touches that reflected Megan's personality. A green plant on the table, landscape photographs discreetly hung on the wall, and a small coffee maker next to her bookshelf. Megan was sitting in her soft leather chair, adjusting to her new space. He wore an impeccable cream blazer and black tailored trousers, a combination that highlighted his confident and professional posture. In her hands, she held a golden pen, a gift from Mike, which glittered softly in the light. As he reviewed his new company's first cases, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Each page felt like a reminder of how she got there, overcoming challenges both personal and professional. The phone ringing broke the silence, and she quickly answered it. Mike's voice on the other end was familiar and comforting, instantly warming her. "How was your first day on the throne?" he asked with a playful tone that made her smile. "Much less glamorous than it looks," she replied, turning her chair to look at the view of Manhattan through the windows. "But also much more significant. I'm proud of you, you know," he said, with a sincerity that made her heart race. Megan held the phone tighter, feeling grateful for the complicity they had built. "And I of you. When does training begin for your official debut?" "Today," he said, a hint of anxiety mixed with excitement. "Do you want to come watch?" Megan laughed softly, leaning back in her chair. "I thought legitimate boxing was less exciting, less dangerous perhaps." Mike countered, laughing along. "But I guarantee it's still exciting." Later, Megan arrived at the gym. As she entered, the familiar smell of rubber and sweat enveloped her, bringing back memories that made her smile. The rhythmic sound of Mike's fists hitting the punching bag echoed through the space, a sound that seemed synchronized with the beat of her heart. She found him in the ring, practicing combinations under the watchful eye of a trainer. The golden sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the contours of his body as he moved with strength and precision. Each blow was a display of focus and dedication, and Megan couldn't help but feel pride rising as she watched it. When he finally noticed her, Mike stopped, taking off his gloves and walking towards her with steady steps. "I didn't expect you to come. I wouldn't miss it for anything," Megan said, crossing her arms and smiling. Mike leaned into her slightly, lowering his voice to a playful tone. "I hope you didn't get tired of saving me." She laughed, shaking her head. "As long as you keep saving yourself, I don't think I'll need it." The two were silent for a moment, exchanging a look that said everything words couldn't. There was something solid between them now, a foundation built on the hardships they had faced together. Later, as Mike finished his workout, Megan watched him from a corner of the gym, her eyes following his every move. She knew he still carried the ghosts of the past, but she also saw that he was more prepared than ever to face them. When they walked out together, the sky was tinged with orange and pink, and the air carried the fresh scent of an approaching night. As they walked side by side, Megan held Mike's hand, feeling the rough texture of the bandages still on her fingers. "Have you thought about what you're going to do after your first official fight?" she asked, looking at him. Mike smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I think I'll want to celebrate with you." She squeezed his hand tighter, a smile lighting up her face. "I think I can make room in the agenda for that." They continued walking down the sidewalk, leaving behind the past they were finally ready to overcome. The future was still uncertain, but together, they felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The night of the fight arrived charged with a palpable electricity, as if the atmosphere itself was anxious about what was about to happen. The gym was packed, its bleachers vibrating with the energy of the crowd. Powerful spotlights illuminated the ring in the center, highlighting the glow of the red ropes and the impeccably clean floor that would soon be the scene of a fierce battle. The smell of freshly made popcorn mixed with the metallic aroma of sweat, creating an unmistakable and almost suffocating mixture. In the hallways of the locker room, the muffled sound of the crowd came as a distant murmur, but Mike's heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to drown out everything around him. He was sitting on a wooden bench, his broad shoulders relaxed, but only on the outside. He was wearing navy blue shorts with gold details that glittered in the light, and his skin glowed slightly with the thin layer of oil that highlighted every line of his well-defined muscles. His trainer stood beside him, precisely adjusting the gloves on his hands, as the faint smell of rubber and grease from the bandages filled the air of the small space. Mike stared at the mirror in front of him, his reflection showing a man who carried both determination and anxiety. The brown eyes, deep and intense, were the reflection of someone who was about to face much more than just one opponent. "Are you ready?" asked the coach, tightening the last ribbon on his gloves. Mike nodded, standing up in one fluid motion. The bench creaked slightly behind him, and he took a deep breath before answering, "Always summer." As he walked down the hallway leading to the ring, the narrow walls amplified the sound of the crowd that grew with each step. The floodlights flickered in little glimpses as he approached, and his footsteps echoed like a tambourine on the concrete floor. Every move seemed to carry the weight of expectations, his, Megan's, and everyone who supported him. Across the gym, Megan sat in the bleachers. His spot had been strategically chosen to give a perfect view of the ring without attracting immediate attention. She wore an elegant black dress that made her stand out among the informal crowd. The satiny fabric lightly reflected the gym lights, while a simple bun tied up her hair, letting a few loose strands fall softly around her face. In her hands, a small golden bag rested on her lap, but her fingers clenched it nervously, as if holding more than one accessory. The smell of popcorn all around was sweet and comforting, but Megan barely noticed it. His attention was completely focused on the empty ring. When Mike appeared, walking towards the center of the arena, the world around him seemed to disappear. He looked larger than life, his steady steps and confident stance belying any doubts he might have harbored inside. Megan felt her heart race when she saw him, a mix of pride and nervousness taking over her. She knew how much that moment meant to him, and as she watched him, she realized that it meant a lot to her too. When the bell rang, the crowd erupted into a frenzy, and Megan held her breath. Mike's opponent was intimidating. Tall, burly, with calculated movements and punches that rumbled like thunder in the gym. Every blow thrown seemed to shake the air, and every dodge from Mike was a reminder of his skill and tireless training. He danced around the ring with grace and precision, his light feet contrasting with the force of the blows he delivered. Every movement was studied, a perfect combination of strength and strategy. Megan felt each punch as if she were the one in the ring. The sound of blows against his body echoed in his ears, but relief came in waves as he counterattacked with speed and intelligence. In the third round, the atmosphere was tense. The entire gym was on its feet, the crowd screaming in unison, but Megan barely heard. His eyes were fixed solely on Mike, his hands gripping the bag so tightly his knuckles were white. She saw the change in him in that moment, the absolute focus as he began to find the openings he needed. Then came the final blow, a perfect cross that seemed to go through the opponent, who fell heavily to the ground. The silence that followed was surreal, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The referee started the count, and Megan held her breath, her heart beating so hard she could hear it. When the count reached 10, the gym exploded. Screams, cheers, and whistles filled the space, but all Mike could hear was his own heavy breathing. He fell to his knees in the center of the ring, hands resting on his hips as he tried to absorb the moment. He had won, not just the fight, but everything it represented. His eyes searched the crowd until they found Megan. There she was, standing, smiling, tears glistening in the lights. He slowly stood up, walking to the ropes as the crowd continued to cheer around him. He gestured for her to come closer, and Megan hesitated for just a second before walking down the steps of the bleachers. As she reached ringside, Mike reached out to help her up. His touch was warm and comforting, and when she was finally at his side, he pulled her into a hug that made time stop. The texture of the rough bandages against his skin contrasted with the gentle touch of his arms. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse and full of emotion. "Of course I came," Megan replied, holding his face in her hands. "I would never let you go through this alone." Mike leaned in, and when their lips met, it was as if all the noise around them disappeared. The kiss was intense, full of passion and relief, a connection that transcended everything they had been through. When they finally separated, the crowd's screams returned, now even louder, celebrating not only the victory, but the moment they were witnessing. "And now?" Megan asked with a sparkle in her eyes that only he could bring about. Mike smiled, holding her hand as he raised her arm in the air, showing everyone that this victory wasn't just his. "Now I have everything I ever wanted." As they walked out of the gym together under the starry sky, the light night wind enveloped them, and the cool texture of the asphalt beneath their feet felt smoother than ever. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, they knew they had each other, and that was all that mattered.